Hey, P here, and welcome to the beginning of a brand new series. A review series on games that I personally find to be the glowing standard in this industry. The diamonds in the rough. The masterpieces of gaming. I totally get that some people believe what's good or not is completely subjective. And yeah, maybe it is a little bit. But I'm going to do my damnedest to try and set as close to an objective checklist as I can for these types of videos. So let's get to it then. What is a masterpiece? Is it several quality characteristics that make up a great game, or is it one? Is it even necessary to have an iconic character leading the story, like Master Chief or Arthur Morgan? Do the graphics need to be on point? Or is it okay to sacrifice the visuals to focus on aspects that the game has deemed more important? These are just a handful of important questions that make it easy to see that the gaming community as a whole could be in disagreement in regards to what makes a game great. But what if there was a more simple metric to measure this by? Maybe not the end-all be-all, but one that serves as the foundation of what separates the men from the boys.
Oh boy. Boy.
After long hours and countless games played in my lifetime, I've come to this conclusion. A game's quality should be directly linked to how well the game accomplishes its task. Maybe that's a little vague, so think about it like this. If the creators of a game want to make a great story, then as consumers, we should judge the game based off whether or not the different functions of the game serve that purpose. If there are things that distract from the story, like a character with a strange arc, or characters interacting with items that aren't cohesive with the lore of that specific world, then those obviously do not go to enhance the game's ability to tell a story. On the other side of that, I am not going to dock points for something lacking in what it isn't trying to be. For example, I'm not going to deduct points for Red Dead Redemption 2 single-player experience because its multiplayer is dog shit. Its multiplayer doesn't have anything to do with its single player. Like, if someone is an electrician, and we're evaluating how good they are at their job, I'm not going to judge this guy by how well he performs as a plumber. I don't care if he's a shit plumber, pun intended. All I care about is if he does things well within the scope of an electrician. Now, before we go any further, let me preface this by saying there are no perfect games. Games can launch with a few bugs or have mechanics that I don't particularly love, but in order to try to be objective here, we need to understand and admit that going in. This is how we'll be judging the games in this series today. And we begin that series by jumping right into Hellblade Senuas Sacrifice.
Abandoned to find peace with the gods. So you will walk into the lair of the beast, look it in the eye, and you will go to war.
The primary thing to consider when evaluating Hellblade is understanding that it is best described as an experience rather than a game. Yes, it is a game, and yes, it does possess some standard video game qualities like combat and puzzles, but you should know going in, you're along for a ride. A ride that is intentionally offering you a perspective into a glimpse of life that more than likely, you've never seen before. Often considered taboo and rarely represented in the entertainment and media industry these days is the idea of representing the intense emotional experience that is living with a mental disorder. Enter Hellblade. The game wants to offer the user a refined experience of playing a character with psychosis. If you're unfamiliar with the diagnosis, some common symptoms of the disorder include, but are not limited to, delusions, hearing voices, seeing patterns where there are none, and perspectives that sometimes force dramatic and illogical conclusions that they wholeheartedly believe. Thanks to Ninja Theory's direct collaboration with English psychiatrist and professor of neuroscience Paul Fletcher, as well as several volunteers who have experience with psychosis, the team could do its best to more accurately portray its main character. The folks behind Hellblade decided the best way to offer this experience was through the eyes of a Celtic warrior named Senua. The magic in picking this setting for an experience was the ability to be historically accurate within the world of Celtic culture that offers the inclusion of their gods and the treatment towards those with mental illness. This approach allows for a foundation from which they could dive into the abstract reality that would be the perspective from which the player would be forced to see the world. Senua, as mentioned before, is a Celtic warrior, specifically from the Pict clan, which during the 8th century could be found at the northernmost point of the British Isles. Historically speaking, the Pict's treatment of the mentally ill was pretty twisted. They were believed to be cursed in such a way that it drove them mad. Once identified, they were referred to as Gelts by their clan and sent off to the wilderness to deal with their curses. Obviously, that didn't go well most of the time. The premise of the game is that, upon returning from her casting out in the wilds, Senua finds that her lover, Dillion, along with the rest of the clan, were murdered, and their village raided by Vikings, who in the game are referred to as the Northmen. The combination of her inability to process the death of her lover and her culture lead us to the beginning of the game, where we find Senua in search of the bridge to Helheim, where she would take Dillion's severed head across the bridge and into the underworld to save her beloved. The opening sequence is a pretty long drawn-out canoe ride, but it serves for more than just an opening credit scene. It firmly introduces the player to the voices in her head, which will be present for the entirety of the game.
They're going to do that to you. Can you see them? Can you see them? They're going to do that to you.
This is fantastic for several reasons. First, the way the development team recorded the voices was by using a binaural audio recording approach. This is done by placing two microphones in such a way that they hear the sounds the same way a person would. This also allows for the recording to be played back as if they occupy a 3D space. The reason for this is to allow the player to hear the voices in their head from different directions. Voices can start out on the right side and fade off to the left, and vice versa. They also use this as a method to bring important messages from a voice that sounds omnipresent.
Everyone hates her. She's cursed.
Which sort of emulates a main voice that comes straight from your mind. Needless to say, this game is meant to be played with headphones on, and choosing to go without would drastically reduce the impact from what is the intended way to play. The audio in Hellblade is something I've actually never experienced in many years of gaming. The audio is much more than an experiential Celtic ASMR, and actually acts interactively. This is done by not only allowing the voices just to generally screw with you, but it offers the auditory prompts for direction and puzzle-solving purposes. This is most obvious in a stage in the game that is completely played in the dark. You're prompted by the voices in your head on which direction you need to move. It's actually terrifying, but it totally works. The audio in-game also acts dynamically with the player. Depending on what's happening around you and what you're doing, things may also be louder or softer. This results in an often overlooked aspect of games that's been perfected in Hellblade. They've taken the audio and used it as what is probably the most important mechanic in the game. Most development teams are scared to do this, with concerns that the players might be listening to music or might have something else playing in the background, but not Ninja Theory. When it comes to delivering art, they refuse to make excuses for the players to not play the game the way it's meant to be experienced. The game also gives you this fair warning every time you boot up, that it is best played with headphones. This is an above-reproach method used by Ninja Theory for those who, for whatever reason, would combat this way of thinking. The best part of the audio is that it's not just the innovation that makes it an essential part of this masterpiece. As we mentioned before in how we identify a gaming masterpiece, the audio perfectly fits and enhances the game's intended goal, to deliver an experience from the lens of someone struggling with mental illness. Keep that in mind as we continue to move on to some of the other features. Next up, we got the puzzles. These are not necessarily the most challenging, but their brilliance, as with the audio, is their continuity in the overall theme of the game. Every single one of the puzzles mechanics is a confirmed symptom of psychosis. The main puzzles will have you encounter doors that are locked and require you to find shapes or patterns in the world to unlock them. Ironically enough, once you have the pattern that needs to be found in the world, most of the puzzles are easily solved by looking at some of the other things that you looked at before, but from a different perspective. Some of the puzzles will also require Senua to step in and out of what seems to be separate realities to see something that you couldn't see in the other reality. These are represented visually, typically by a brightening or darkening filter that coincides with a distinct change in the weather. This allows for a very obvious difference in energy between the two realities that often creates a sense of dread when you know you have to enter one to complete the portion of the puzzle. Personally, I found the puzzles to provide the continuity of the main message of the game while still remaining tastefully done. You'll see this in the remaining themes of the game as well. One of the aspects of the game that is key to separating it from an interactive film is the combat. It's easy to think that the combat was sort of an afterthought of development, as it's not the foremost selling point for the game as it is with a lot of other games. The funny part about that is, it's not bad at all. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it's quite good. A lot of folks have their criticisms for the simplicity of it, but honestly, that's where I found its brilliance. Combat is as simple as a quick attack, a heavy attack, a dodge, and the parry system. The ongoing development in combat throughout the game stems from the enemies you face and your growing comfortability with the system. In the beginning, the game doesn't give you any prompts when your first enemy appears. He towers over Senua with a giant sword as he makes his way towards you. For the first time in the game, I noticed two things. There's no HUD at all, and it sure as hell wasn't going to give me any how-to texts or prompts as this brute was bound towards me. Secondly, I noticed how close the over-the-shoulder camera was. I began the encounter just guessing the buttons, allowing my tremendous amount of gamer experience to really carry me. I quickly figured out the buttons and began the oddly satisfying and very intimate experience that was the combat. Later, the game sensed my growing confidence and began throwing more than one enemy at a time. It even offered several types of enemies for me to engage with. It's here I noticed a few more things. I see why the camera is so uncomfortably close. The enemies spread out around you and easily place themselves out of sight, as you can only see one of them at a time. It was here I noticed some of my inner voices would aid me when an enemy would take a swing at me, yelling, "Behind you!"
Behind you!
I'd quickly press the parry button and whip around to feel the weighty impact of my steel, neglecting theirs from its target. Funny part about that is, sometimes the voices would indicate an attack and there would be none. Bastards, I'd think to myself, but this only acted to immerse me even more as Senua continued to fight her demons. I also came to realize that with every successful hit, dodge, and parry, a glimmering from my waist grew brighter and brighter. My mirror, which indicated my progress towards a special move. This move allowed me to slow time and eradicate my enemies. Honestly, combat feels personal in a way that is really difficult to describe. When enemies would land blows, Senua would lean over and show signs of her being wounded. She would move and react slower. But the cool thing was, as this was true for me, it was also true for my enemies. Some of the coolest experiences I had in the game were when both me and my opponent were hunched over after a taxing battle. Like the same feeling you got in Super Smash Bros. When you're both on your last life and at 200%, it's like, dude, next hit wins. And that experience to me was delivered flawlessly. Piggybacking off the portrayal of the voice as a combat mechanic, the game also manipulates the player into believing that there's a permadeath mechanic. In the scene towards the beginning of a game after an unavoidable death cinematic, the game tells us, the dark rot will grow each time you fail. If the rot reaches Senua's head, her quest is over. This is brilliant for several reasons. First, it could easily be interpreted as an introduction to a permadeath mechanic. As a matter of fact, when the game released and the user base first encountered this, that's exactly what everyone thought. Rumors of an extremely difficult game circulated the internet, spreading the falsehood that was the threat of losing your save file if you died too many times. It wasn't until testing was done that proved no matter how many times you die in the game, you do not lose your save file. But admittedly, during my first playthrough some years back, I specifically remember how this added to the sense of dread I felt while playing the game. I felt nervous and anxiety-ridden during every single encounter. I was vulnerable, just like Senua. To me, this was perfect, but there are some that felt Ninja Theory had betrayed their trust, an apparent gaming sin that I was unaware of. But did they actually lie? In my opinion, no, they didn't. What if I told you this was introduced the same way everything in the game was introduced, through the perspective of someone with psychosis? The darkness or rot representing an appeared physical manifestation of her mental illness. And as her psychosis shows itself through delusions and patterns that are completely believed by her, this is just another symptom towards the same goal the game put forward, to put the player in the shoes of someone struggling with this illness. You can't reasonably be upset with this, because as much as this is a lie to the user, so is the game in its entirety. The game constantly lies to us, which is the point, especially if you look at the story as a whole. It's far more likely that in actuality, Sen was just wandering through some forest, seeing things and believing that she's on a dark fantasy quest. This is another perfect example of Ninja Theory risking the reception of the game for the sake of its end goal, for the sake of art. One of the things that will easily stand out to any player during their experience with Hellblade is the way that it's presented visually. The world is full of assets attributed to Viking lore, and whether it's the sun-soaked atmosphere in the beginning of the game or the overcast gray and green of the swamps later on, every environment seems perfectly created. Turns out, the art team was given priority to create the environments first. You can easily see the reward in giving the priority before creating any of the characters they would use to interact with these settings. The lighting in Hellblade is one of the things that truly enhances the visuals, even enhancing emotional appeal during cinematics where fire from a torch emits light that bounces off Senua's face, allowing for an even deeper glimpse to see what she's feeling. The crazy part about how the game looks is that when it was released, Hellblade was a hard lock capped at 30 frames per second. But since replaying the game for this review, I played it on an Xbox Series X, which along with the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro and PS5 offers 3 options for visuals to suit your preferences. A performance mode that targets a locked 60 FPS, a high resolution mode that captures the beauty of 4K but at 30 FPS, and an enriched visuals mode that offers much more detail in-game. You would think for a beautiful experience that enhanced visuals would be the way to play, but it's not as simple as that. Enriched visuals offers longer geometry draw distances, better shadows, and increased foliage density. The geometry draws mean that assets in the distance will be popping into the screen less, and will help what's on screen feel more full and rich. The density of the foliage and better shadows helps the world to feel even more lush and vibrant. I won't try to tell you which mode to play on, just be ready to experiment with the settings to see which option fits you the best. Hellblade was created using the Unreal Engine 4, which plenty of beautiful games have been created by. Cool things to note is recently Unreal Engine 5 has been announced, and one of the cool aspects of this is creators have stated that all projects in UE4 are transferable to UE5, which could potentially mean that we could eventually get an extremely beautiful port up sometime in the next few years. Another thing that makes the game feel so personal and real is a commitment from the developers to create a character that looks and reacts in a very human way. This was done with the 3D facial scanning device used to capture the actors and actresses' facial movements and expressions. You can truly tell the care in which Ninja Theory crafted every detail and design for the character of Senua. From the details of the fur worn on her shoulders to all the dangly bits like her dreadlocked hair, every detail perfectly interacts with the motion of the character. The detail in the character's facial model is probably the most pivotal aspect of Senua. The cracked paint on her skin and layered over her nervous gaze and the constant tremble of her lips bring an impact to the emotional appeal that the player can easily feel. This was one of my favorite things about Hellblade. Even more so after I researched it and found that there was a very good story behind the actress that played Senua. As it turns out, Ninja Theory had struggled to bring on an actress to play the role. With the game still in development, they would need a stand-in to use as they continue the timeline of creating the game. Enter Melina Jurgens.
Hi, my name is Melina Jurgens and I play the heroine Senua in Hellblade Senuas Sacrifice.
Melina was originally a video editor for Ninja Theory, who was asked to stand in as Senua until a new actress could be cast. Although she admitted that acting was one of her deep dark fears, she brought a weight and depth to the character that fit perfectly. She would eventually be asked to continue as Senua full-time. Melina hesitantly accepted, and one of the great video game performances would follow. I particularly enjoyed her performance because I never thought about how she appeared until writing this review. Through the entirety of the game, the only thoughts that I had for Senua was about her struggle and impactful display of emotions during crucial plot points. With the recent PC push into the gaming industry, needle-pinning how women are portrayed in what the PC police consider to be a misogynistic industry, I personally found Senua to be the perfect counter-argument. Senua and Melina are not the sexually exaggerated female characters that critics seem to be so concerned about. Senua was perfectly crafted as an actual human female model that enhances realism and connectivity to the character. I've noticed now in my research that no one seemed to have much to say in regards to her performance, through the standpoint of political correctness, that is. The point of me saying all this was to point out the hypocrisy of the concerned critics of the industry and their opinion on the hobby we all love so much. We do not need protagonists to be all male. We do not need them to have perfect model-type bodies with exaggerated features just to find it reasonable to allow a female lead. No, we don't need that to appreciate the game. Hellblade puts on full display the most important thing when getting behind a protagonist aren't whether they're a man or a woman, or attractive or not. It is simply whether or not they distract from the point of the game. I'm looking at you, Neil Druckmann. You suck. Let me be clear when concluding this section though. I'm not saying that Melina Jurgens is ugly. I'm not saying she's attractive. What I am saying is that her appearance in this game did not distract the user and lure them out of an immersive experience. She did a wonderful job as Senua, and I can't possibly imagine the character in any other way than as is. Hellblade Senuas Sacrifice bore a difficult weight in what it attempted to do from the very beginning. It stared mental illness in the face and looked to conquer a tasteful representation of it in a way that hasn't really been done before, through video games. Through research, trial and error, and transparency, Ninja Theory has crafted a wonderfully articulate and detailed experience that feels one of a kind. The game has been received so well, in fact, that Microsoft not only picked it up to add to its library of games on Game Pass, but have backed the creation of a Hellblade 2 as a Microsoft exclusive. I honestly can't wait to revisit Senua. I'm sure she's doing just fine. Holy shit, Sen, what the hell's Jokes aside, Ninja Theory has done something that we would never expect from a small team of 20-ish people. Something we wish a AAA studio in the industry would try harder to craft instead of exploiting us for every freaking penny we own. They've created a game that does perfectly well what it sought out to do. And that, my friends, is why Hellblade Senuas Sacrifice is an absolute masterpiece. Hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you sticking it out all the way through the video. These types of projects take me some time to make, so if you liked it, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel for more reviews just like this one. If you have points you agree or disagree with, make sure you leave a comment. Also, what other games should be on the Masterpiece series? What's something you'd like to see a video on? I look forward to hearing from you guys. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.